The leather pouch felt heavier than it should have in Josephine Miller's calloused hands as she stood outside the First National Bank of Fort Laramie, Wyoming, watching the well-dressed stranger in the pinstriped suit adjust his gold watch chain with fingers that had never known a day of honest labor. It was late September in 1878, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street where horses stamped their hooves and wagons creaked past with their loads of supplies heading west. She had worked 3 years as a seamstress in this rough frontier town to save the $243 that weighed down her threadbare reticule, stitching late into countless nights by candlelight until her fingers bled and her eyes burned with exhaustion, all so she could finally invest in something that would change her life forever. "Miss Miller, I must say again what a wise decision you are making," the man said smoothly, his voice like honey poured over butter. His name was Cornelius Blackthorne, or so he claimed, and he had arrived in Fort Laramie just 2 weeks earlier with promises of riches beyond imagination. "The Denver Mining Consortium is offering shares at rock-bottom prices for only a limited time. Once we strike that silver vein my surveyor located just north of Pikes Peak, early investors like yourself will see returns of 10, perhaps 20 times your initial investment within 6 months. Josephine felt her heart hammering against her ribcage as she looked down at the official-looking documents he had spread across the small table outside the mercantile. The papers were embossed with fancy seals and signatures, though she could not read well enough to verify their authenticity. At 22 years old, she'd been orphaned at 15 when cholera took both her parents during the journey west, and she had learned to survive on her own through sheer determination and endless work. The thought of multiplying her savings into enough money to open her own dress shop, maybe even hire other women who struggled as she did, made her hands tremble with anticipation. "I have the money right here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she began to untie the strings of her pouch. The coins clinked together with a sound that represented every sacrifice, every meal skipped, every winter night she had shivered under thin blankets to save money on firewood. "Excellent. Excellent," Cornelius said, reaching forward with eager hands that reminded Josephine of a vulture stretching its talons toward carrion. "If you will just hand over the funds, I will provide you with your certificate of ownership and, madam, I would not do that if I were you." The voice came from behind her, deep and steady with the kind of authority that made people stop and listen. Josephine spun around to find herself looking up at a tall cowboy who stood with his thumbs hooked into his belt, his weathered face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. He could not have been more than 25 or 26, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of storm clouds that fixed on Cornelius with unmistakable suspicion. A well-worn Colt revolver hung at his hip, and everything about his stance suggested he knew exactly how to use it. "Excuse me, sir, but this is a private business transaction," Cornelius said, his smooth tone developing a sharp edge. "The lady and I were just concluding our arrangement." "The lady was just about to make the biggest mistake of her life," the cowboy said, not taking his eyes off the supposed investor. "I have seen your kind before, mister. You blow into town with your fancy papers and your promises of easy money, take everything these good people have saved, and disappear before anyone realizes there never was any mine or any consortium." Josephine felt a cold sensation spreading through her chest as she looked between the two men. "What are you saying? Mr. Blackthorne showed me the surveyor's reports and the incorporation documents. Everything is legitimate." The cowboy finally shifted his gaze to her, and she saw something in his eyes that looked like genuine concern rather than the condescension she usually received from men in this town. "Madam, my name is Robert Hayes. I have been working cattle drives between here and Denver for the past 8 years, and I know for a fact that the Denver Mining Consortium does not exist. I also know that there is no silver strike north of Pikes Peak, because I just came through that territory 3 weeks ago." "This is slander," Cornelius sputtered, gathering up his papers with hasty movements. "I will have you know that I am a respected businessman with connections throughout the Colorado Territory. If you continue to interfere with my legitimate enterprise, I will be forced to involve the local authorities." Robert took a single step forward, and despite being several inches shorter than the cowboy, Cornelius seemed to shrink back. "Please do involve the sheriff. I'm sure Marshal Crawford would be very interested in seeing those documents of yours. In fact, I was just heading to his office when I saw you out here preying on this young lady." The color drained from Cornelius Blackthorne's face faster than water through a sieve. He stuffed the papers into his leather satchel with trembling fingers and took several steps backward. "I suddenly recall that I have urgent business in Cheyenne. The opportunity I was offering Miss Miller will unfortunately have to be extended to other investors. Good day." He turned and practically ran toward the hotel, his polished shoes kicking up small clouds of dust with each hurried step. Josephine stood frozen, watching him disappear around the corner while her mind struggled to process what had just happened. The pouch of money still sat in her hands, suddenly feeling less like a promise of a better future and more like a weight of crushing reality. "He is gone," she whispered, then louder. "He is gone, and I almost gave him everything." Her knees began to buckle, and Robert moved quickly to catch her elbow, steadying her with a gentle but firm grip. "Easy there, madam. Why don't we get you out of this sun and somewhere you can sit down proper?" Josephine nodded numbly, allowing him to guide her toward the covered porch of the Mercantile, where several wooden chairs sat arranged in a row. She sank into one of them, clutching her savings against her chest, as if someone might still try to take it from her. The enormity of what had almost occurred washed over her in waves of nausea and relief and anger, all mixed together until she could not tell which emotion was strongest. Robert pulled another chair around to face her and sat down, removing his hat to reveal dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. His face was honest and open, marked by sun and wind, but somehow kind in a way that made Josephine feel she could trust him. "I'm sorry I had to intervene like that, but I could not stand by and watch you get robbed." "Robbed," she repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "I was going to hand it to him willingly. I was so desperate to believe that there was an easy way out of my circumstances that I did not even question whether his story made sense." "There is no shame in hoping for something better," Robert said quietly. "Men like Blackthorne, or whatever his real name is, they make their living by exploiting decent people's dreams. You are not foolish for wanting to improve your situation. You are just human." Josephine looked up at him, really studying his face for the first time. There were small scars on his jaw and forehead, the kind that came from hard living and probably a few fights, but his eyes held no meanness or mockery. "Why did you help me? You don't even know who I am." "I know you were someone who worked hard for that money in your hands," he said, gesturing toward the pouch. "I know you deserve better than to have it stolen by a confidence man. Beyond that, I suppose I helped because it was the right thing to do, and my mama raised me to do right when I have the chance." A small, shaky laugh escaped Josephine's lips. "Your mama raised you well, Mr. Hayes. I owe you a debt I don't know how to repay." "You don't owe me anything, and please call me Robert." He settled his hat back on his head and gave her a slight smile that created creases at the corners of his eyes. "Though if you are feeling charitable, you could tell me your name so I don't have to keep calling you madam." "Josephine Miller, but most people call me Joe." She finally allowed herself to relax slightly, loosening her death grip on the money pouch. "I've been in Fort Laramie for 3 years, working as a seamstress out of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house where I rent a room." 3 years is a good stretch," Robert said, leaning back in his chair. "I have been through this town more times than I can count on cattle drives, but I only recently decided to settle in the area. Got tired of spending 8 months out of every year eating trail dust and sleeping on the ground. What made you decide on Fort Laramie?" He shrugged, his expression becoming thoughtful. "I have been saving my pay same as you, and I finally have enough to buy a small ranch about 15 miles south of town. It is not much, just 160 acres with a creek running through it and enough grazing land for a modest herd, but it is mine. Well, it will be mine once I finish the paperwork with the land office." Josephine felt a pang of envy mixed with admiration. "That sounds wonderful. Having something that belongs to you, building something permanent. That's all I want too." "Then you will get it," Robert said with a certainty that made her almost believe him. "Just not by trusting smooth-talking strangers with fake documents. If you don't mind me asking, what were you hoping to do with your money if you had invested it wisely?" She hesitated, unused to sharing her dreams with anyone, but something about Robert's genuine interest made the words flow more easily than usual. I want to open my own dress shop. Not just alterations and mending, but actual dressmaking with fabrics shipped from back east and maybe even from Europe. There are more women coming to Wyoming every year, and they want nice things, beautiful things that remind them of civilization. I'm good at what I do. Mr. Hayes, Robert, I know I could make a real business of it if I had the capital to start. I believe you, he said simply. Anyone who can save over $200 on a seamstress's wages has the kind of discipline and determination it takes to run a successful business. The sun was beginning to sink lower in the western sky, painting the rough buildings of Fort Laramie in shades of gold and amber. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun started its descent, and Josephine shivered slightly in her worn cotton dress. Robert noticed immediately and stood up, starting to remove his jacket. "Oh no, I couldn't," Josephine protested, but he was already draping the coat around her shoulders. It smelled like leather and sage and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken in a way she did not entirely understand. "I've been working in the sun all day. You will be doing me a favor by taking some of this heat," he said with a grin that suggested he knew perfectly well he was bending the truth. "Listen, Miss Miller, Joe, I don't mean to be forward, but I would rest a lot easier if you would let me walk you back to your boarding house. That Blackthorn character might be halfway to Cheyenne by now, or he might be angry enough about losing an easy mark to cause trouble." Josephine knew she should probably refuse, should maintain the proper distance that society demanded between unmarried men and women, but the thought of walking back alone through the darkening streets suddenly seemed unappetizing. "I would appreciate that, thank you." They walked side by side through Fort Laramie as the town settled into its evening rhythms. Saloon doors swung open to release bursts of piano music and raucous laughter, while shopkeepers began closing their shutters and lighting lamps in their windows. Robert kept a respectful distance, but Josephine found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, the easy way he moved, and how other men seemed to step aside to let them pass. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house stood on the quieter north end of town, a two-story building that had been painted white once, but now showed more gray wood than white paint. The widow who ran it was strict but fair, providing clean rooms and 2 meals a day for reasonable rates. Josephine had called the small room on the second-floor home for almost the entire time she had been in Fort Laramie. "This is me," she said as they reached the front steps. She reluctantly began to remove Robert's jacket, but he waved her off. "Keep it for now. I will be in town for at least another week handling business with the land office and buying supplies for the ranch. I can collect it when I see you again." "When you see me again?" Josephine repeated, her heart doing a strange little flutter. Robert's expression became somewhat bashful, a look that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "I was hoping I might. If you would not object, that is. Perhaps I could buy you dinner tomorrow evening. There's a new restaurant near the fort that supposedly serves a decent steak, and I figure I owe you a proper meal after spoiling your afternoon plans." "You saved me from financial ruin," Josephine pointed out, but she could not keep the smile from spreading across her face. "If anything, I should be buying you dinner. How about we both just enjoy the meal and not worry about who owes who?" He met her eyes, and in the fading light, she could see flecks of blue mixed with the gray. "What do you say?" Josephine knew she should probably think about it, should be cautious and sensible and all the things a proper young woman was supposed to be, but she found herself nodding before her rational mind could intervene. "I would like that very much. 6 o'clock?" 6 o'clock? Robert agreed, his whole face lighting up with pleasure. "I will meet you right here." She watched him walk away, his long stride carrying him back toward the main street until the gathering darkness swallowed his silhouette. Only then did Josephine realize she was still wearing his jacket and clutching her savings and smiling like a fool. Mrs. Patterson opened the front door at that moment, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Josephine Miller, who was that man, and why do you have his coat?" the older woman demanded, though there was a glimmer of something that might have been approval in her expression. "That was Robert Hayes," Josephine said, climbing the steps with a lightness that had been absent from her movements for as long as she could remember. "And I believe he just saved my life." That night, Josephine lay in her narrow bed with Robert's jacket draped over her thin quilt for extra warmth, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of their encounter. She thought about how he had stepped in without hesitation, how he had treated her with respect and kindness without expecting anything in return, how his smile had made something dormant inside her chest suddenly wake up and take notice. She'd been so focused on survival and saving money for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be young and alive and open to possibility. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, her dreams were filled with storm-gray eyes and the scent of sage. The next day dragged by with excruciating slowness. Josephine had 3 dresses to finish hemming and a complicated alteration on a traveling suit that required all her concentration, but she found her mind wandering every few minutes to the evening ahead. She changed her outfit 4 times, eventually settling on her best dress, a deep blue cotton with small white flowers that she had made herself. It was far from fancy, but it fit well and brought out the color of her eyes, or so Mrs. Patterson said when she caught Josephine examining herself in the hallway mirror for the 3rd time. "You are nervous," the older woman observed, not unkindly. "This cowboy must be something special." "I barely know him," Josephine admitted, adjusting the simple cameo brooch at her throat. "But yes, I think he might be special. Is that foolish?" Mrs. Patterson considered the question seriously. "Foolish would be ignoring your instincts about a man who shows you who he is through his actions. From what you told me, this Robert Hayes saw you in trouble and helped without asking for reward or recognition. That speaks to character. What you do with that information is up to you, but I would say your instincts are pointing you in a good direction." Robert arrived exactly at 6 o'clock, cleaned up and dressed in what were obviously his best clothes. He had shaved and combed his hair back, though one stubborn curl insisted on falling across his forehead. He held his hat in his hands and looked almost as nervous as Josephine felt, which somehow made her relax slightly. "You look beautiful," he said as she came down the stairs, and the simple sincerity in his voice made her blush. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." She handed him his jacket, freshly brushed. "I took good care of it." "I never doubted you would." He helped her into her own shawl and offered his arm. "Shall we?" The restaurant was called the Prairie Rose, and it occupied a newly constructed building that still smelled of fresh sawdust and paint. The owner, a transplanted Frenchman named Pierre who had come west seeking gold and found his fortune in cooking instead, greeted them with enthusiasm and showed them to a table near the window. Oil lamps cast a warm glow over the interior, and checkered tablecloths gave the place a touch of refinement that was rare in Fort Laramie. I have not been to an actual restaurant in over a year," Josephine confessed as she looked at the handwritten menu. "Usually, I eat whatever Mrs. Patterson makes, or I cook soup on the stove in my room." "Then we will have to make this meal count," Robert said. When the waiter came, he ordered steaks for both of them with all the accompaniments, plus a bottle of wine that made Josephine's eyes widen at the price. "You don't have to spend so much," she protested. "I would be happy with just—" "I want to," Robert interrupted gently. "I have been saving my money for years to buy land, and now that I have it, I realize I need to remember how to actually enjoy life too. Besides, when was the last time you did something just for the pleasure of it?" Josephine opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, as she realized she could not remember. Every decision she made was calculated for maximum efficiency and minimum cost. The idea of spending money on something as intangible as pleasure felt foreign and vaguely dangerous. "That's what I thought," Robert said softly. "So let's make a deal. For tonight, we both forget about saving and scrimping and worrying about tomorrow. We just enjoy good food and good company. Can you do that?" She took a deep breath and nodded. "I can try." The meal was extraordinary. The steak was tender and perfectly cooked, the potatoes were fluffy and rich with butter, and the wine was smooth and warming. But even better than the food was the conversation. Robert told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, how he had come west at 18 after his father died, and his mother went to live with his sister's family in St. Louis. He described the cattle drives with vivid detail, making her laugh with stories of ornery steers and greenhorn cowhands, making her gasp with tales of river crossings and stampedes in lightning storms. "Sounds dangerous," Josephine said, leaning forward with her chin propped on her hand. "Didn't you ever want to quit and find something safer?" "Every single time we ran into trouble," Robert admitted with a laugh. "But then we would deliver the herd. I would get paid, and I would remember why I was doing it. Every dollar brought me closer to having my own place, my own future. Same as you with your savings. Except I almost threw my future away to a con man, she said, the shame still fresh. Robert reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the gesture feeling entirely natural despite their short acquaintance. But you didn't. You still have your money and your dream. Now you just have to figure out the right way to make it happen. They talked for hours, long after they had finished eating and the other diners had departed. Josephine found herself telling Robert things she had never shared with anyone, about how scared she had been when her parents died, about the kindness of the wagon master who made sure she made it to Fort Laramie safely, about the loneliness of those first months when she knew no one and had nothing but her sewing skills to keep her alive. "You are one of the strongest people I have ever met," Robert said when she finished, his eyes intense in the lamplight. "Most folks would have given up or made bad choices out of desperation. You kept your head up and did what needed doing. That takes real courage." "I didn't feel courageous," Josephine said quietly. "I just felt scared and stubborn." Sometimes those are the same thing. He signaled for the check, and despite Josephine's protests, he paid for everything. As they walked back through the cool night air, he offered his arm again, and she took it without hesitation this time. "I had a wonderful time tonight," she said as they approached the boarding house. Stars filled the sky overhead in vast swaths of silver against black, the kind of sky that only existed far from city lights. "Thank you for that." "The pleasure was entirely mine." Robert paused at the bottom of the steps, still holding her hand. "Joe, I know we just met, and I don't want to presume anything, but I would really like to see you again. Tomorrow and the day after that, and as many days as you will give me while I am in town." Josephine's breath caught in her throat. She had received attention from men before, usually the wrong kind, from cowboys who drank too much, or trappers who came to town looking for female company of the paid variety. This was different. Robert was different. He looked at her like she mattered, like he wanted to know what went on in her mind as much as what she looked like. "I would like that too," she said, her voice coming out barely above a whisper. "Very much." The smile that spread across Robert's face was bright enough to rival the stars. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, the gesture old-fashioned and courtly and absolutely perfect. "Then I will see you tomorrow. Sleep well, Josephine Miller." She watched him walk away again, but this time she knew he would be back. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of happiness that Josephine had never experienced before. Robert came by the boarding house every morning before she started work, bringing coffee and sweet rolls from the bakery and staying to talk while she drank her breakfast. He would return in the afternoon when she finished sewing for the day, and they would walk through Fort Laramie together, exploring every corner of the town she had lived in for 3 years but never really seen. He showed her the creek where he used to water his horse during cattle drives, a peaceful spot with cottonwood trees that had turned golden with the advancing autumn. They watched the soldiers drill at the fort, and Robert explained military formations with the knowledge of someone who had considered enlisting once. They attended a dance at the community hall, where Robert proved to be surprisingly graceful despite claiming he had 2 left feet. "You lied about not being able to dance," Josephine accused as he spun her through a complicated reel without missing a step. "I said I had 2 left feet," Robert countered with a grin. "I never said they didn't know how to dance." But more than the activities, Josephine treasured the conversations. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing dreams and fears and observations about life with the kind of openness that usually took years to develop. Robert spoke about his hopes for his ranch, how he wanted to build not just a business, but a real home, maybe even a family someday if he could find the right woman to share it with. The way he looked at her when he said that made Josephine's heart race. She told him about her plans for the dress shop in greater detail, describing the layout she had drawn in her journal and the suppliers she had researched back in Cheyenne. Robert listened with genuine interest, asking questions and offering suggestions that showed he took her ambitions seriously. "You should do it," he said one afternoon as they sat by the creek, watching the water flow past. "Not invest in some scheme, but actually do it. Rent a space, order your fabric, hang out your sign. You have enough money to start small and smart." "I'm scared," Josephine admitted, voicing the fear that had kept her locked in place for months. "What if I fail? What if I spend all my savings and nobody comes? Then I will have nothing." Robert was quiet for a moment, picking up a smooth stone, and turning it over in his fingers. "You could fail," he said finally. "That's true of any venture worth taking. But you know what is guaranteed to fail? Never trying at all. Then you will spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been, and that seems like a worse fate than risking failure." His words struck something deep inside her, a truth she had been avoiding. She had been so focused on not losing what she had that she had forgotten the whole point was to build something more. "When did you get so wise?" she asked, bumping his shoulder with hers. "I'm not wise. I'm just a cowboy who has made plenty of mistakes and learned from most of them." He threw the stone into the creek, watching the ripples spread outward. "But I know that the things I regret most are the chances I didn't take, not the ones I did. Even when they didn't work out the way I hoped, at least I tried. At least I was living instead of just existing." They sat in comfortable silence after that, shoulders touching while the world moved around them. Josephine realized that somewhere in the past 2 weeks, Robert Hayes had gone from being the stranger who saved her money to being someone she could not imagine her life without. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. On Robert's last day in Fort Laramie before he had to go back to his ranch to start building and preparing for winter, they took a long walk that led them outside of town to a hill that overlooked the North Platte River Valley. The autumn colors were at their peak, painting the landscape in gold and red and orange against the endless blue Wyoming sky. "I don't want you to leave," Josephine said quietly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Robert turned to her, his expression serious. "I don't want to leave either, but the ranch won't build itself, and I need to get everything ready before the snow comes. Wyoming winters are not forgiving." "I know," she wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the afternoon sun. "It's just that these past 2 weeks have been the happiest I've had in years, maybe ever. The thought of going back to my room and my sewing and not seeing you every day feels impossible." "Then don't." Robert took both her hands in his, pulling her to face him directly. "Jo, I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other for 2 weeks, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I'm falling in love with you. Actually, I think I am already there. I love your strength and your determination. I love the way your nose scrunches up when you are concentrating on something. I love how you see the world and how you make me want to be a better man." Josephine felt tears pricking at her eyes, happy tears that threatened to spill over. "Robert, Wait, let me finish," he interrupted, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. "I'm not asking you to give up your dreams. I would never ask that. But what if we could build our dreams together? You could open your dress shop in town, and I could build the ranch. We could get married and make a life that includes both our futures. I know I don't have much to offer except hard work and a lot of hope, but I promise I would spend every day trying to make you happy." "You are asking me to marry you," Josephine said, the words coming out in a stunned whisper. "Yes." Robert's hands tightened on hers. "I'm asking you to take a chance on us, on what we could build together. But if it is too soon, if you need time to think about it, I understand. I will wait as long as you need." Josephine looked at this man who had crashed into her life like a force of nature, who had saved her from her own desperation and then shown her what it meant to really live. She thought about the safe, small existence she'd been building, squirreling away money for a future that was always just out of reach. She thought about what Robert had said about regrets and chances not taken. "Yes," she said, and watched his eyes widen with surprise and hope. "Yes, I will marry you. I'm terrified and exhilarated and probably crazy, but I want to build a life with you. I want to take the chance." Robert let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the valley, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that made the world spin. Josephine kissed him back, pouring all her hope and fear and love into the moment, feeling his heart hammering against hers in perfect synchronization. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and grinning like fools, Robert pressed his forehead against hers. "I will make you happy, Jo. That's my promise. Just love me," she said softly. "That's all I need." They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Fort Laramie, with Mrs. Patterson and the local minister as witnesses. Josephine wore her best dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Robert wore his cleanest shirt with his hair slicked back and a look of wonder on his face that made her want to cry happy tears. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever hardships the frontier life might bring. After the ceremony, they had a celebration dinner at the Prairie Rose, where they had shared their first meal together. Pierre outdid himself with a wedding feast that seemed impossibly elaborate for the Wyoming frontier, and he refused to accept full payment despite Robert's protests. "You bring love and happiness to my restaurant," the Frenchman said with a dramatic wave of his hand. "This is worth more than money, no?" That night, Josephine moved her few possessions out of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house and into the wagon Robert had loaded with supplies for the ranch. Everything she owned fit into 2 trunks and a carpet bag, a stark reminder of how little she had accumulated in 3 years of hard work. But she also had her savings, her sewing machine, and a heart so full of love and hope that it felt like it might burst. The journey to Robert's ranch took most of the following day, traveling south from Fort Laramie on rough trails that tested the wagon's springs and Josephine's resolve. But Robert pointed out landmarks along the way, sharing the history of the land with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found where he belonged. They saw pronghorn antelope bounding across the plains and heard coyotes singing in the distant hills. "There," Robert said as they crested a rise in the late afternoon, pointing to a valley below where a creek glinted in the sunlight. "That is home." Josephine looked down at the land that was now half hers, seeing it with fresh eyes. There was a small cabin, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, situated near the creek where cottonwoods provided shade. A simple corral held 3 horses that whinnied at the wagon's approach. The land stretched out in all directions, covered in prairie grass that waved like an ocean in the constant Wyoming wind. It was raw and wild and beautiful in a way that took her breath away. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. The cabin was crude but solid, built by the previous owner who had given up and headed back east. It consisted of 1 main room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder, and a small addition that could serve as storage or a workshop. The furniture was minimal, just a table, 2 chairs, a bed frame, and some shelves, but Robert had scrubbed everything clean and even put fresh wildflowers in a jar on the table. "I know it is not much," he said, sounding nervous as Josephine explored every corner, "but we can add on, make improvements. Eventually, I want to build a proper house with multiple rooms and real glass windows," and Josephine silenced him with a kiss. "It is perfect because it is ours. We will make it into whatever we want it to be, together." That first night in their new home, they lay together in the loft, listening to the wind whisper through the gaps in the walls and the creek murmuring its endless song outside. Robert held Josephine close, his arms wrapped around her protectively, and she felt safer than she had since her parents died. "Are you scared?" he asked quietly into the darkness. "Yes," she admitted, "but I'm also happy. I did not know those 2 things could exist at the same time." "That is just life on the frontier," Robert said with a soft laugh. "Everything is scary and wonderful all mixed together. You just have to decide which one you are going to focus on." "Then I choose wonderful," Josephine said, snuggling closer. "I choose this." The following weeks tested that resolve in ways Josephine had not anticipated. Ranch life was harder than anything she had experienced in Fort Laramie, requiring physical labor from dawn until long after dark. Robert was patient and kind as he taught her the endless tasks that came with running a ranch, but there was no way to make feeding animals, hauling water, chopping firewood, and maintaining fences anything other than exhausting work. Her hands, already calloused from years of sewing, developed new calluses and blisters that made holding a needle painful. Her back ached from lifting and carrying. Her legs hurt from walking miles every day across uneven terrain. There were moments, usually in the gray hour before dawn, when she had to leave the warm bed to start breakfast and feed the chickens Robert had acquired, when she questioned whether she had made a terrible mistake. But then Robert would wake up and stumble down from the loft, his hair sticking up in every direction, and pull her into his arms for a good morning kiss that tasted like sleep and promises. Or she would catch him watching her with an expression of such love and gratitude that it made her heart ache. Or they would sit together on the porch after dinner, holding hands and watching the stars come out while they talked about their plans and dreams. In those moments, Josephine knew she had made exactly the right choice. As October gave way to November and the air grew sharp with the promise of winter, they fell into routines that made the work more manageable. Robert focused on building up their herd, trading work with neighboring ranchers to bring in more cattle before the snow came. Josephine took over the household management, cooking and cleaning and organizing their supplies for the long winter ahead. But she also found time for her sewing, setting up her machine in the main room near the window where the light was best. Word spread among the scattered ranch families that there was a skilled seamstress in the valley, and women began making the journey to commission dresses and alterations. Josephine charged fair prices and did beautiful work, and slowly her savings began to grow again, this time tucked away in a tin box under a floorboard with Robert's knowledge and approval. "You are building your dress shop piece by piece," he said one evening as she carefully folded a finished dress to return to its owner. "Just in a different way than you originally imagined." "It is not what I pictured," Josephine agreed. "But I think I like it better. I am my own boss, I set my own hours, and I don't have to worry about rent or overhead. Plus, I get to live with you, which was never part of the original plan but is definitely the best part." Robert crossed the room and pulled her up from her chair, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I am pretty fond of that arrangement myself, Mrs. Hayes." Mrs. Hayes. She still got a little thrill every time she heard her new name. Josephine Hayes. It sounded like someone strong and capable, someone who could build a life in the wilderness and thrive. The first snow came in mid-November, a light dusting that melted by noon but served as a warning of what was to come. Robert doubled his efforts to finish the lean-to addition he was building onto the cabin, working by lantern light after dark until his hands were too cold to hold the tools. The extra space would serve as Josephine's sewing room and give them much-needed storage for supplies. "You are going to work yourself to exhaustion," Josephine scolded one night as she rubbed liniment into his sore shoulders. "The addition can wait until spring if necessary." "I want you to have a proper space for your work," Robert insisted, though he groaned in relief as her fingers worked out a particularly stubborn knot. "You deserve better than trying to sew in the corner of our main room with fabric spread across the table where we eat." "I have done worse," she reminded him. "I spent a year sewing in a room so small I could touch both walls with my arms spread. This cabin is a palace by comparison." But she was secretly touched by his determination to give her what she needed, just as she tried to make his life easier in whatever ways she could. They were learning the rhythm of partnership, the give and take that made two separate people into a functioning team. The heavy snows arrived in early December, transforming the valley into a white wonderland that was breathtaking and isolating in equal measure. The nearest neighbors, the Sullivan family, lived 3 miles away, and visiting was no longer a casual afternoon activity. Robert had to check the cattle twice daily, making sure they had access to water and the hay he had stored for winter feeding. On the worst days, he came back to the cabin covered in snow and shaking with cold, and Josephine would help him strip off his frozen layers and warm him by the fire. "This is the hardest part of ranching," he admitted one particularly brutal evening as they huddled together under every blanket they owned. "Not the work itself, but the constant worry that I am not doing enough, that I will lose animals to the cold or the wolves or simple bad luck." "You are doing everything right," Josephine assured him, running her fingers through his hair in the way that always calmed him. "The rest is up to nature and fate. You cannot control everything, Robert." "I know, but I want to. I want to make this place successful so you never have to worry about money or security again." Josephine pulled back to look him in the eye, her expression serious. "I married you, not the ranch. If we lost every cow tomorrow, I would still be happy as long as we have each other. Don't forget that." Robert kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "You did not find me," she corrected with a smile. "You saved me from my own foolishness, and then you stubbornly refused to leave until I fell in love with you." "Is that how you remember it?" "That is exactly how it happened." She settled back against his chest, listening to the wind howl outside their walls. "And I would not change a single moment." Christmas came, their first as a married couple, and they celebrated alone in their snowed-in valley. Robert had hidden away a few surprises, presenting Josephine with a beautiful bolt of deep green fabric he had purchased secretly in Fort Laramie, and a set of matching thread in every color she could want. She gave him a new shirt she had sewn in secret, working on it only when he was outside, and a muffler knitted from yarn she had traded for with Mrs. Sullivan. They cooked a special dinner with one of their chickens and the last of the potatoes from the root cellar, and Robert produced a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion. They drank it mixed with hot water and honey, toasting to their love and their future and the life they were building together. "Next Christmas we might have a baby," Josephine said softly, voicing the hope that had been growing in her heart for weeks. Robert's eyes widened. "Are you saying—" "Not yet," she interrupted, laughing at his expression, "but I am saying I want that. I want our children to grow up here, to know this land and this life. I want to build a family with you." "I want that too," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than I can say. A house full of kids, your dress business thriving, the ranch successful, the whole dream." "We will get there," Josephine promised, "one day at a time." Winter slowly released its grip on the valley as January turned to February and then March. The snow began to melt, revealing the brown grass beneath and the first tentative green shoots that promised spring. Robert's cattle had survived the winter with only minimal losses, a success that made him walk a little taller and smile a little easier. In April, Josephine's suspicions were confirmed when the doctor in Fort Laramie verified what she already knew in her heart. She was pregnant, due to deliver in late autumn. Robert received the news with a whoop of joy that probably echoed all the way back to town, and he immediately began making plans for expanding the cabin before the baby came. "We need at least 2 more rooms," he declared, pacing around the property and gesturing at the air. "A proper bedroom for us and a nursery for the baby, and eventually more rooms for more children. We will need a bigger kitchen too, and maybe a real parlor where you can receive your sewing clients properly." "Robert, slow down," Josephine laughed, catching his arm as he strode past. "We have months to figure all that out. Let's not build the whole house in one day." But his enthusiasm was infectious, and soon she found herself caught up in the planning too. They drew diagrams on pieces of paper, arguing good-naturedly about the placement of windows and the size of the kitchen. Robert hired help from town, young men looking for work who could assist with the heavy construction while he managed the ranch duties. As her belly grew round with their child, Josephine found herself having to adjust her routines. The physical work of ranch life became more challenging, and Robert absolutely refused to let her do anything he deemed too strenuous, which led to several spirited discussions about her capabilities. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she insisted when he tried to stop her from carrying water from the creek. "I know that, but I also know that you push yourself too hard," Robert countered, gently taking the bucket from her hands. "Let me take care of you for once. You spend all your time taking care of me and the house and your sewing clients. Let me do this." She wanted to argue, but the love in his eyes stopped her. "Fine, but I'm not sitting idle. There's too much to do." "Then sit and sew and rest and let me do the heavy lifting," literally. They compromised, as they had learned to do about most things. Josephine focused on her sewing business, which was actually growing faster than she had anticipated. Women from ranches within a 20-mile radius made the journey to commission work, and word of her skill had spread all the way to Cheyenne. She had more orders than she could handle, which meant she had to start being selective about what projects she accepted. "You need to raise your prices," Robert said one evening as he reviewed her accounts. "You are charging too little for the quality of work you provide. These ladies would pay twice what you are asking, especially since you are the only skilled seamstress within a day's ride." "I don't want to price myself out of reach," Josephine protested. "Some of these women are ranch wives just like me. They don't have unlimited money." "Then offer different price levels. Charge more for the elaborate work and less for simple alterations, but stop undervaluing your skills." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You are not desperate anymore, Joe. You don't have to accept any price just to get the work. You have a reputation now. Use it." She thought about his words and realized he was right. The fear and scarcity mindset that had governed her thinking for so long no longer applied. She had a home, a husband who loved her, a baby on the way, and a thriving business. She could afford to value herself properly. The house expansion was completed in late August, just in time for the hottest part of summer. The new structure more than doubled their living space, adding 2 bedrooms, a larger kitchen, and a dedicated sewing room with big windows that caught the morning light. Josephine cried when Robert carried her over the threshold of their expanded home, overcome with gratitude for how far they had come from that afternoon in Fort Laramie when he had stopped her from making the worst mistake of her life. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest, "for everything. For saving me, for loving me, for building this life with me." "Thank you for saying yes," Robert replied, kissing the top of her head, "for taking a chance on a cowboy you barely knew, for believing we could make this work." Their son was born on October 15th during the first snow of the season, coming into the world with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the valley. Robert held Josephine's hand through the long hours of labor, wiping her forehead and whispering encouragement until the midwife from the Sullivan Ranch finally placed the baby in Josephine's arms. "He is perfect," Josephine breathed, staring down at the tiny face that was somehow already familiar. "Robert, look at him. We made this." Robert was crying unashamedly, tears streaming down his weathered face as he touched his son's tiny fingers. "He is beautiful. You are beautiful. I cannot believe this is real." They named him Thomas William Hayes after both their fathers, and he became the center of their universe. Robert was a devoted father from the first moment, getting up for night feedings even though Josephine was nursing, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours just holding his son and marveling at the miracle of his existence. "I never knew I could love something this much," he confessed one night as they watched Thomas sleep in his cradle. "It is almost frightening how much I would do for him, how fierce I feel about protecting him." "That is being a parent," Josephine said, leaning against his shoulder. "Welcome to the most terrifying, wonderful experience of life." The years flowed past like the creek outside their door, each season bringing new challenges and new joys. The ranch prospered under Robert's careful management, growing from a modest operation to one of the most successful in the region. Josephine's sewing business evolved into a mail-order operation, with customers as far away as Denver sending for her custom designs. Thomas was joined by a daughter, Margaret Rose, when he was 2 years old, and then another son, James Robert, 3 years after that. The house expanded again to accommodate their growing family, and the valley that had seemed so empty when Josephine first saw it now rang with the sounds of children's laughter and life. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Robert took Josephine back to Fort Laramie for a celebration dinner at the Prairie Rose, leaving the children with the Sullivan family. Pierre was still running the restaurant, now with grown children of his own helping in the kitchen, and he greeted them like the old friends they had become. "Man, 10 years," Robert marveled as they sat at the same table where they had shared their first meal together. "A decade since I saw you about to hand over your life savings to that con man." "Don't remind me," Josephine groaned, though she was smiling. "I was so naive." "You were desperate and hopeful," Robert corrected. "There is a difference. And look what came from that moment. Everything we have, everything we are, started right here in this town on that autumn afternoon." Josephine reached across the table and laced her fingers through his, looking at the man who had become her entire world. He was older now, with silver threading through his dark hair and deeper lines around his eyes, but he was still the cowboy who had stepped in without hesitation to save her from her own mistakes. "I fall more in love with you every single day," she said softly. "That first day, I thought you were just a kind stranger, but you became my best friend, my partner, the father of my children, my whole heart. Thank you for seeing something worth saving when you looked at me." "I saw a woman who was strong enough to survive alone, but brave enough to accept help when it was offered," Robert replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I saw someone who worked hard and dreamed big and deserved every good thing life could offer. I saw the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life loving, even though I did not know it yet in that moment." They stayed in Fort Laramie overnight, a rare luxury of time alone without the demands of ranch and children, though they spent most of the evening talking about Thomas and Margaret and baby James. In the morning, they walked through the town together, revisiting all the places that held meaning in their courtship. They stopped at the spot outside the mercantile where Robert had first intervened, and Josephine tried to remember the frightened, desperate woman she had been. That person seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life entirely. "Do you ever regret it?" Robert asked quietly. "Giving up your dream of a dress shop in town to become a rancher's wife?" Josephine turned to him, cupping his face in her hands. I didn't give up my dream. I just found a better one. I have my sewing business, our children, our home, and you. That is worth more than any shop could ever be. The years continued their steady march, bringing changes and challenges but also deep contentment. Their children grew strong and healthy, learning the rhythms of ranch life and developing their own dreams and personalities. Thomas showed an aptitude for working with cattle that made Robert beam with pride. Margaret had inherited Josephine's talent with needle and thread, spending hours in the sewing room creating elaborate designs. James was still too young to show his interests, but he had a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. On their 20th anniversary, Robert surprised Josephine with the deed to a small building on Main Street in Fort Laramie. She stared at the paper in confusion until he explained. It is for your dress shop, he said, nervous as a young man courting his first love. I know you have the mail order business and that works well, but I also remember how much you wanted a real shop with your name on the door. Thomas is old enough to help me run the ranch now, and Margaret is nearly 13. They don't need you as constantly as they once did. So if you still want it, we can make it happen. Josephine was speechless, tears streaming down her face as she processed what he was offering. Robert, I don't need a shop. I have everything I want right here. I know you don't need it, he said gently, but I want to give it to you anyway. Call it a very late wedding present. We could hire someone to watch James during the days you were in town, and you could finally have that business exactly the way you originally imagined it. If you want it, no pressure either way. She thought about the young woman who had stood outside the bank 20 years ago, clutching her savings and dreaming of independence. She thought about everything that had happened since, the life she had built with this man who continued to surprise her with his thoughtfulness and love. Can we do it together? She asked finally. Not me running a shop while you run the ranch, but creating something that belongs to both of us? Maybe you could handle the business side, the accounts and suppliers, while I focus on the creative work? Robert's face lit up with understanding and joy. A true partnership. I love that idea. They opened Miller Hayes Dressmaking the following spring, transforming the small building into a beautiful shop with Josephine's designs displayed in the window and fabrics from around the world lining the walls. Margaret worked there on weekends, learning the business side while perfecting her sewing skills. Robert did indeed handle the accounting and supply ordering, discovering he had a knack for negotiation that saved them money and improved their profit margins. The shop became more than just a business. It became a gathering place for women in the region, somewhere they could come not just for dresses but for conversation and community. Josephine hired 2 other seamstresses, both young women struggling to make their way in the world just as she once had, and paid them fair wages while teaching them advanced techniques. "You're doing what you always wanted," Robert observed one evening as they locked up the shop and headed home to the ranch, making beautiful things and helping other women at the same time. "We are doing it," Josephine corrected, taking his hand. "This would not exist without you, without us. Everything good in my life comes back to that day you stopped me from handing my money to Cornelius Blackthorne. Everything good in my life comes from you saying yes when I asked you to marry me," Robert countered. "I think we are both just incredibly lucky." They were in their early 50s when Thomas announced he was getting married to a young woman named Sarah from Cheyenne, and the family threw itself into wedding preparations with enthusiasm. Watching her son stand at the altar and speak his vows, Josephine was transported back to her own wedding day, remembering the fear and hope and overwhelming love that had consumed her. "He looks happy," Robert whispered, reaching for her hand. "He looks like you did on our wedding day," Josephine replied, terrified and joyful and absolutely certain. "That sounds about right." Robert squeezed her hand as their son kissed his new bride. "Think they will be as happy as we have been? If they work at it the way we have, then yes. Marriage is not always easy, but it's always worth it when you find the right person." More grandchildren followed, filling the ranch house with noise and energy during visits. Margaret married a teacher from Fort Laramie and gave them twin granddaughters who were absolutely identical and absolutely exhausting. James eventually followed his own path, becoming a rancher on land adjacent to the family property, ensuring the Hayes name would continue in the valley for another generation. As they moved into their 60s, Robert and Josephine began to slow down, handing over more responsibilities to their children while maintaining the roles that brought them joy. Robert still checked the herds daily, unable to fully retire from the work that had defined so much of his life. Josephine still designed dresses, though she left most of the actual sewing to her employees while she focused on the creative aspects she loved most. On their 40th anniversary, their children threw them a celebration at the ranch, inviting everyone they had known over the decades. The house overflowed with family and friends, stories and laughter, food and music. As evening fell and the party continued around them, Robert pulled Josephine away for a walk down to the creek where they had spent so many evenings over the years. 40 years, Josephine said, settling onto their favorite spot where a fallen log made a perfect bench. That is a lifetime. It is our lifetime, Robert corrected, sitting beside her and pulling her close. And I would not change a single moment. Well, maybe the winter of 1883 when we lost half the herd to that blizzard. That was rough. Josephine laughed, the sound blending with the creek's constant murmur. We survived that. We have survived everything because we had each other. Do you remember what you said to me on our first anniversary? Robert asked, his voice going soft with memory. You said you chose wonderful over scary. Do you still feel that way? She turned to look at him, this man who had been her companion through 4 decades of life, who had given her children and grandchildren and a love deeper than she had ever imagined possible. His hair was white now, his face lined with the marks of years spent in sun and wind, but his eyes still held the same kindness and strength that had drawn her to him on that long-ago afternoon. Every single day, she said firmly, I wake up next to you and I choose wonderful. I chose it 40 years ago when I said yes to your proposal, and I have chosen it every morning since. I will keep choosing it for whatever time we have left. Robert kissed her then, a kiss that held 40 years of shared history and promised devotion. I love you, Josephine Hayes. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. I love you too, she whispered back. My cowboy hero who saved me from my own foolishness and then gave me the world. They sat by the creek as darkness fell and stars emerged, listening to the laughter floating down from the house where their family celebrated. The valley that had been empty when they started now teemed with life they had created, built on a foundation of love and trust and hard work. Josephine thought about the young woman who had almost thrown away everything to a con man, who had been so desperate for a better life that she nearly destroyed her only chance at having one. She thought about the cowboy who had stepped in without hesitation, seeing something worth saving in a stranger's eyes. She thought about every choice and every challenge that had brought them to this moment, sitting side by side in the place they had made home. Thank you, she said quietly, the words encompassing everything they had been through together. For what? Robert asked, though she could hear the smile in his voice. For stopping me that day, for taking a chance on us, for building this beautiful life with me, for 40 years of choosing wonderful. Robert stood and offered his hand, pulling her to her feet with the same gentle strength he had shown since the beginning. Come on, Mrs. Hayes, our family is waiting and I want to dance with my wife. They walked back to the house together, hands clasped, hearts full, ready to celebrate the life they had built from a single moment of intervention on a dusty street in Fort Laramie. The music swelled as they entered, and Robert swept Josephine into his arms for a waltz, spinning her around the room while their children and grandchildren watched and cheered. This was their legacy, Josephine realized as she moved in perfect rhythm with her husband, not just the ranch or the business or the material things they had accumulated, but the love they had nurtured and the family they had created. Every person in this room existed because a cowboy had stopped a woman from making a terrible mistake, and then had the courage to love her. As the song ended and another began, as the celebration continued into the night, Josephine rested her head on Robert's shoulder and smiled. The Wild West had been tamed over the decades they had lived here, but the spirit of adventure and possibility that had brought them together remained. Their story had started with near disaster and transformed into enduring love, proving that the best things in life often came from the most unexpected places. Happy anniversary, my love, Robert murmured into her hair. Happy anniversary, Josephine replied, holding tight to the man who had saved her and then spent 40 years showing her what it meant to be truly, completely happy. The stars shone bright over the Wyoming Valley that night, watching over the ranch house filled with light and love and laughter, bearing witness to a story that had begun with intervention and grown into something magnificent. And if the wind carried whispers through the cottonwoods by the creek, they spoke of second chances and wise choices and the kind of love that lasted forever.